Hey, Terry Caliendo from Dedicated Managers here again, and I wanted to finish up on the abstraction of the database variables or the database fields to configuration files. So I've finished that up, and now my app, for the most part, is pretty much dynamic. Is very dynamic in that I can change these entities over here. I can change my configuration files is what I'll show these to be, and ultimately the entire database will change for whatever it needs to be used for. So there's no diving into code. There's code at this point, but these are just objects. You're not actually going in and to any of the files that source files for the views and changing anything. So if you want to add a form field, you just add it to this object here, which I'll talk about in a second, but you're not going in and you don't have to create the database field. You don't have to go and create the field in the form. You don't have to tie the form to the database and all that stuff. All you do is just change this one little thing right here and it updates everywhere. So that's been my entire goal, is to make this application reusable, and that's why I'm open sourcing it. So let's talk about what I did and how I did that. So first, take a look here. This is the file structure now. So source contains the source that creates the views, which would be all of this stuff that we're looking at on the front end. When you click here, that's part of the view. When we click and we switch into this is a form right here. That's part of the view. And so these form fields, first name, middle name, last name, they are not embedded in a form anywhere. They come from the configuration files. So if we want to find, this is my root entity because it's the very first level one. This part is still hard-coded. I'll talk about that maybe. But the forms are not, and the subforms. So this income is a sub-entity of primary kinship caregiver. So the kinship caregiver can have multiple streams of income. So we can add, I can add an income type and an amount. I am not following rules right now. I'm not restricting what can be typed, but you can add multiple incomes. So this guy can have two incomes for his single, primary kinship caregiver, just like children. You could have 1, 3, or 5 children. So rather than trying to make, all of this, this is the point of this whole database, is these nested entities allow you to have what's called a one-to-many ratio. I have one primary kinship caregiver, and I can have many incomes on that primary kinship caregiver. It's called a one-to-many relationship. So everything, all the sub-entities have a one-to-many relationship with the primary caregiver at this point. So if we go back to what I was trying to get to, the first name, middle name, last name, that's loaded from a configuration file. Just like when we click to add, say, income, this is that same form. This form doesn't have any sub-entities to it, so you're not seeing anything on the side, but it has income type and income amount. So if we take a look at this, somewhere in a configuration file we should see the first name, middle name, last name, and somehow this primary kinship caregiver gets defined, and somehow this income stream gets tied to the primary kinship caregiver. So if we go and look at the configuration files, that's going to be up in my config now. So the source was the view, which you don't have to touch to change the application for a different use. You'll go into the config area, and ultimately this config, these are just JavaScript objects at this point. So there's no code other than this code that's in question marks. I'll talk about that in a minute. Question marks in quotation marks. So it's really a string, but it will get evaluated as code at some point. But ultimately, everything in this configuration area is simply a JavaScript object. Even better, it's a JavaScript object that's simple enough that could become a JSON object that would easily be converted to a JavaScript object. and therefore, it could be loaded from another place, and that's where ultimately I'll create a front end that creates this configuration file for you when you do some dragging and dropping. But for now, it's you have to create the configuration files to configure the program. So how do I do that? Well, let's go back to what I was talking about. I wanted to talk about how I was configuring this, creating this primary kinship caregiver and its fields, and then relating a child entity to it. So we go back to the code. The root entity is what gets loaded, and the rest of this stuff can have all different names because they are just tied to the root entity through imports. And ultimately, they could just be embedded directly in this file, but it makes it cleaner to embed the children as objects of the as sub-entities, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. So the root entity needs to stay root entity because it gets loaded by the template. And I'll talk about that again in a little bit. But right now I'm just trying to define what the root entity is. So the root entity is going to be the parent entity of your application. So whatever thing you have that's going to contain other things. So I'm trying to track a single person who's taking care of other people's children and all the information that goes along with all of that. But everything ties back up to one primary root entity. In this case, we call that person the primary kinship relative caregiver, or the primary kinship caregiver. And so this title right here, this is the configuration. This root entity is the configuration of that root person. So that is again this over here. So that title, primary kinship caregiver, what's showing up there actually comes from my config file. So if I change that to primary kinship caregiver X and save it, I should see it update here in the in the form. So let's change that back, and after it compiles we should see it change back and disappear. I've got hot reloading going on here, so it automatically updates. So you can see that this is my configuration for that person, and there's a collection ID, so that relates to how I'm going to store the this entity, this person, all this information. How is it going to get stored in the Firebase database? So that shows up in the Firebase Firestore. That's this key right here. Actually, it would be a collection ID, and then these are the documents underneath the collection ID, which is the individual caregivers. So right now I have 3 caregivers. I have Terry Leonard Caliendo, I have Terry Lowe Caliendo, and I have my beautiful wife Laura Caliendo. So that would be these 3 right here. So, but if we go into any single one of them, again, we're describing the fields. So, that's the collection ID on the Firestore. This is the title, so anywhere it shows up that I need a title. This is the icon that I'm going to use in various places. Really it's for the sub-entities. So this sub-entity uses an icon of a $sign. If I add a child, its icon is a person icon. So that's what those define. The add button icon can be different, so that's where the add, this one has a little plus next to it as opposed to this one doesn't, so they're different icons. And that comes from material design. You can pick any one of the icons there, and you can also ultimately load in, I don't know if I'm doing it, but the other icon sets like Font Awesome and whatnot. Let's see, so then there's the add button text. What do you want the add button to say? Add income or add child. So that's more for the, right now I'm showing a parent entity, and so that's not really used right now. So I'll show that again in the subchilds. The eval functions, so these are functions that need to be evaluated. I just stuck them in one thing. The breadcrumb, I need to say a difficulty with having the forms being dynamic. I don't know what to put up here in the breadcrumbs, because each entity is different and undefined and not defined till the user defines it. So what do you want up here when it's loaded? What do you want to show for the breadcrumb? So in this case, the breadcrumb of the root one, I add the first name, I take the last name, comma, first name, middle name. And so that's what I'm defining here is I've got this variable entity fields. This is not well documented yet other than what I'm telling you. You can call this entity form fields, which are all the form fields on the entity. And you can say, hey, take the last name and then add a comma and then add the first name and the middle name. And so we'll see that for every object or every entity, it's going to have need a breadcrumb defined, so you have to tell it what it's going to use. And then sub-entity list, I'm actually not even sure what I'm using that for right now. Okay, that's actually that's something that didn't get updated. Actually, it should be sub-entity display list play text. So here's one of the child. That income child where I say put the income dash entity ID for the breadcrumb. That's when we go into a child, that's this right here. It's telling it what to display. And then the sub-entity list display text, what do we want to show? I believe that when it's here, what text do you want to show here to represent a short version of that form? So with the child, it would be the names of the child. Currently, that's showing up as undefined. I'll probably fix that. But if this has 7 different fields, if income, it's only got 2, but if it had 7 different fields, how do I want those fields, that form to be represented in a single line when it's just showing it a brief version of it on the parent? So. So so this I'm getting into pretty specific on the stuff. Let me show. So on delete, trying to get away from being too specific here. But I've already gone down this road, so I might as well finish up. On delete, what message do you want to show when somebody clicks the delete button? So that's this delete button on the form. So the message is, are you sure you want to delete this? Kinship caregiver, or for add income, it's got that same form, so I have to tell it what to write in this display. So that's all configurable. Do you want to delete this income? So that would be on the child. It would be, are you sure you want to delete this income? On the parent, it's, are you sure you want to delete this primary kinship caregiver? This route thing I actually took out. That needs to be deleted because the route is now just dynamically generated for when it's deleted. It just goes back to the parent. Before I had that at one point, I had to hard code that until I figured out how to make that simple. And then the form fields. So let's say, and this is where the true dynamicness comes in. Let's say I want I realized I needed a secondary street address and I don't have it. Well, I just go and I can just copy, the format, add it in, and now I call this the field name secondary. And I could change the rules. The rules are it's as defined by Viewdify. How you would define rules for a text field. And this is just some code that says, this code says it can't be empty, and this code says it has to be, the text entered has to be less than 30 characters. And that's just right now I've done a lot of copying and pasting. I haven't really configured those fields, those rules to what they should be. But anyway, so that's all it takes, right? My form, this is my form before. I haven't hit save yet, so it's first name, middle name, last name, primary street address, and then birth date. But if I go and I save this form, and I go back to the database, and now suddenly there's my secondary street address. It just shows up. I didn't have to add it to the form visually. I didn't have to add it to the database. Everything's dynamic now, so you can just throw that in there. You can take it out if you want. It'll still remain in the database everywhere. It's not going to go delete the actual keys anywhere, but for now, what it is, it's just easy to add stuff. And the only downside right now is migrating. If I wanted to move secondary street address to a different entity, that I wouldn't be able to take the data with it easily. But I can move it around. If I don't like its position, I'll put in a 5-way. So if I don't like its position, say I wanted for some reason secondary address to come before the primary address, I just copied it and pasted it above, saved the file, the configuration file, and boom, now the secondary street is above the primary street. So very easy to move form fields around within a form, and very easy to add new ones. So and you can easily update. If first name was spelled wrong. If first name should have been first name, let's say I'll make it wrong, and then I'll go back and correct it. It's just that easy to, oops, that's wrong. Hey, just go and change the configuration file and make it correct. So everything's configured. There's the change right there. Everything's configured dynamically from configuration files, and you don't have to go to multiple places in code. You just come to one place in the configuration file, and it creates your forms. And there's various types of fields. You don't just have to use a text field. You can use a date field, a checkbox, and I'll be integrating as Viewtify adds more. Viewtify just landed a whole bunch of new types of form fields, which I'll be adding. It's not difficult to add them. If we go into components here, let's see. Well, they took all the new. Everything said new the other day. Let's see, where are, is it inputs or forms? Let's try inputs here. There's all the new stuff. They got auto-completes, combo boxes. I'm not sure what forms is. Maybe that's a generic thing. So inputs are what I'm using text fields right now. So this is the text field I'm using currently, and I'm going to put in text areas, so these are all the different things that will ultimately, I'll transition into the ability to use in my forms here. Right now, the main ones I'm using are date pickers, which is outside of the inputs, and select boxes. So that's the selects here. Let's see if they give examples. That's all the configuration stuff. Actually, the select is, this is a select, sorry. So that would be, in mine, that would be here. Here's the selects. And that is represented in the configuration file as a field type select, and then you define the field items right here in the, I'm still in the configuration file for that root entity. So, that's all the stuff that defines that form. I'll kind of digress there. So now we got to talk about the children entity. How is a child entity linked to a parent? Well, it's pretty simple. Every entity, they're all going to, even the child entities and the parent entities, they all have the same format. They have this this initial stuff that defines what to do and stuff about the entity, and then it has its own form fields. It also has its list of subentities. And so I could put the code for the subentities right in this file, but then it just gets to be a huge file. So ultimately, I just create variables and import those objects from other other files. So like the primary kinship caregiver income, that comes from an import up here where I just go and I get that, that other configuration file. It's just an object that gets loaded into this variable. And so then I just say, hey, you know, that variable, stick that variable in the key for this subentity with this key name. And so that ties the child to the parent. And then if we look at that child, you know, it's got the same format, right? It's all that stuff is the same on the top. Here's all that same configuration stuff, all the way collection ID, all the way down to form fields. Collection ID, this one is a little out of order, all the way down to form fields. So, and then it could itself have children. So the one that has children, so if we take a look at this parent here, so this is the root entity here, and then if we look at a child has its own form data and it has its own sub-entities. Well, so the child is the kinship child, no pun intended. So if we look at the kinship child, which is related to the parent, so the root entity has this kinship child stuck to it, which is one of the, you know, the sub-entities. So if we go and get that kinship child file, here's the definition for the child, and the child itself has its own sub-entities, kinship child income and kinship child custody status. So that is these two right here. So it can go on forever the way I've designed it, that, you know, if this child custody status, if it needed to have sub-entities, I may have lost the connection here. I've been having issues with this maximum call stack size exceeded. I think that's got something to do with the development environment interfering with Firebase. But anyway, you know, if I was to add a child, you know, the custody status might have its own children. I don't know what they would be, but, you know, in a different world, you know, it's just like the I have this case plan, you know, it has a child, and I don't know if guardianship has a child. No, I guess it doesn't, but it could. So it could just keep going so that everything just keeps filtering down to having children. It's very dynamic like that. So there's no limit to the nested entities and how deep they can go, just about how crazy you want to be with sending them downwards. And it's all done by the configuration files, where you just, you know, stick those entities, the sub-entities in where you want it to be for the entity it's on, and then just kind of roll everything up. And again, you know, I could take this entire code right here. I could just take this entire object, you know, copy it and paste it right here. That's virtually what this import that I'm doing is doing. It just makes it cleaner and easier to see if I don't have everything all in one file. I can just see quickly that all the these are all the sub-entities, because I'll actually paste it here. So once I paste it, you know, now you've got this root entity, and then you've got sub-entities. Actually, I didn't paste that right. I guess I didn't copy the thing. So if I copy it and I paste it, you know, now you've got this huge this sub-entity, you know, this kinship child sub-entity. I mean, it's all listed right here, so it's hard to tell all the, you know, it goes primary kinship caregiver, kinship child. What's the next one? I got to scroll down to find it. So I'm going to undo that. And so it's just easier to look at it like this and know that the kinship child is a sub-entity, and then that's actually loaded. This is actually a variable that is importing, you know, that kinship child JS object as an export, so that this object actually gets exported as kinship child. So then, you know, it becomes this variable, and so I'm pulling that kinship child export and putting it in there. I think I've hammered that home enough. Hopefully, I've pretty much beaten that to death. So, you know, that's how all of this this configuration is happening. So pretty cool, I think, in that, you know, I've abstracted this program out so that, if somebody else wanted to come in, or if I wanted to use this app for a different use, anything that has anybody that has a database that needs forms with subforms, it's very dynamic. We can create whatever we want and attach the subforms and or the sub entities to entities, and it's up and running. All you have to do is change these objects to be whatever you want them to be. So I'll kill this video here. It looks like I'm at 25 minutes. I'm already losing my voice. And in the next video, I will show exactly how this action takes place. What did I do to make it so this root entity gets loaded? Where does it get loaded into the app, and how does the app handle it? So I'll talk about that in another video. Again, Terry Caliendo, Dedicated Managers. Thanks for paying attention if you did. Hopefully you understood some of that, a lot of it. Hopefully, feel free to leave me comments. Let me know what I'm, where I'm confusing and how I'm being confusing, or where I'm rambling. Or if you've got a compliment, I highly appreciate the compliments, because it really motivates me to keep trying. So thanks a lot. Have a great day. Happy programming.